Welcome to the Courage Never Quits podcast, where members of the West Point class of 1986 tell their stories. I'm your host, Paul LaFontaine. My guest today is John Callahan, Cullum number 43001. We'll hear about Jack's Bolivia trip as a cadet and his securing a slot at the medical school based on a contact made in the long gray line. As always, the views expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and not of West Point, the Army, or any government organization, most particularly the Veterans Administration. Jack Callahan, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. Good to be here, Lawrence O'Donnell.
You have the column number of 43001. You are literally number one.
That's some serious gematria there. I mean, if you look into the number 43 followed by 2 zeros times 2, I mean, by my math, that's 86. And I know a lot of people credit Pompeo with being number one and Larry Oliver number 2, but, you know, I'm right there somewhere in the mix.
No, you are number one. So talk a little about your situation now.
So I currently work for the VA. Hopefully, many of the people listening to this podcast are affiliated or at least have signed up for the VA. I'm an internal medicine physician, but I have a unique job. I do what's called the home-based primary care program, where I literally am like the old country doctor. I physically will go to the homes of veterans that can no longer access the VA. And I do a fair amount of end-of-life care. So I do a lot of hospice care. It's an excellent program. And like I said, it's available in every VA across the United States. Staying out of a hospital is a very strong recommendation. That's a class 1 recommendation.
There you go. So, yeah. Now, I have to imagine you hear some quite wild stories for some of these old veterans as you go in there. Can you share any of one of the wilder ones where you just kind of scratched your head and said, now that's a story?
I actually took care of a gentleman one day, and we were looking through his scrapbook after the appointment. And I was looking through his pictures, and he kept meticulous records. And when I say meticulous records, I mean, he knew every bomb run he went on. Wow. He was a D-17 navigator. And it turns out this gentleman actually bombed my mother during the Second World War.
There's
my mother was a German national. Yeah. And I asked him a very telling question. I said, you know, growing up, my mom used to say she knew when the Americans were going to bomb as opposed to the British because she would see the Christmas trees. And we always thought, well, what would that possibly mean, the Christmas trees? And I never got an answer until I went out to see this veteran in Skaneateles, New York. And I said, you know, my mom used to say when the Americans were coming and they were bombing, she would see the Christmas trees. What would she have been talking about? He goes, that was the chaff. And I go, the chaff? He goes, absolutely. He goes, we would drop metal chaff, you know, which from the ground would probably look like a Christmas tree.
Particularly to a
and
child.
It would be shining and shimmering.
Yeah,
to break up, I assume, the radar or whatever they had at the time or the gun sights. But that, you know, I actually learned from a man who bombed my mother what, you know, the 8th Air Force was doing over Germany.
This is the power of being 43001. You get to go right back to the source.
Absolutely.
Now you're in Syracuse, New York now, which is where you grew up. Is that right?
It is. I grew up right in the city of Syracuse.
And how did it transpire that you went back to Syracuse? What drew you back other than that's your hometown?
So I was in medical school. I was down across the river from West Point, actually. That's a later story, but I went to New York Medical for the first 2 years. Very expensive school. It was a private Catholic medical school. And as soon as I could leave, because of the matchup you needed with the courses and everything, I was going into clinical rotations. I elected to pull a favorite card there, and I was able to transfer back to Syracuse. I went from paying $42,000 a year to $8,800. So the logic was simple: go back home. And literally within, I'd say, 2 weeks of being in Syracuse, I met my future wife.
There you go.
So marrying a girl from here, having family here, it was a natural to. So about the only, you know, ever since I got out of the service in 1990, I had the 4 years of medical school. I did 3 years of residency then. And then I went to Watertown. Actually, my first job I took was up where the 10th Mountain was by Watertown. I worked up there about 7 or 8 years. And then, you know, even though it was an hour north of Syracuse, we were missing out on many, many family events just because it was an hour away.
Sure.
And then my wife and I elected to bring everybody back home, and it was the best decision ever.
Yeah.
So,
So let's
yeah.
go back to 1978 to 81 ish, Syracuse, New York. Young Jack Callahan. What was it about West Point? Downstate, I guess. I don't know if you called it that at the time, but what was it about
Yeah,
West
it would
Point
have
that
been
attracted you?
downstate back then. I think I had greater aspirations for myself, perhaps, than, the finances of the Callahan family could afford. Um, and I won't say it was purely a financial decision, but, my father was a former soldier in the 1st Infantry Division, and he was stationed in the Army of Occupation. That's how we met my mom. So when we took family vacations, there was no Disneyland. There was no, going to an amusement park. We went to battlefields. We went to Saratoga. We went to Gettysburg. That was the Callahan family vacation. So I think I had an idea at the time what West Point was about, and it matched up with, I was one of 7 children, and I was number 5 in the line.
Oh, there you go.
So there literally was no money left in the kitty.
Right.
By the time you got to number 5.
I think there was a shockingly large percentage of our class who came from similar circumstances around the family finances not being able to match our ambitions, and I certainly am in
That's
that camp.
absolutely my case. Yeah,
Good,
no,
yeah, good.
that's absolutely.
So, at high school, what were you known for? Were you an academic standout? Were you an activities guy, an athlete? What was your forte?
So a little bit of everything, expert at nothing. I ran a little bit of track. I played basketball, but I was a good speaker. In high school, I was part of the, a very good debate team, but it was called extemporaneous speaking. So to my credit in high school, I got 3rd in New York State, and then I got 6th in the National Catholic Forensic League finals. Not the NFL, the NCFL. But that actually, I think it helped the application. It established that this guy could blarney with the best of them.
1 C away from the big show, but a
Yes,
big enough
right.
show to get you to the
National
academy.
Catholic Forensic League, the NFL, as we NCFL.
Well, I went to a Catholic school as well and didn't even qualify for the NCFL, so I can say you're an order of magnitude beyond my own skills, sir.
So
preparing for West Point, did you do any preparation, or were you a last minute guy? What was the entry like?
So I did mad preparation. I remember part of the candidate fitness testing was the standing broad jump. And we had concrete steps out in front of our home. And, I would practice literally 20, 30 times a day, the standing broad jump leap. That's not part of it anymore. To include the basketball throw, I remember I could knock out 15 pull-ups, but I weighed all of 150 pounds at the time. So to knock out 15 pull-ups maybe isn't that big of an accomplishment.
Well, you still got to give it to yourself. No matter what your weight is, a pull-up's a pull-up. So good for you.
Yeah. I listened to Mo Gillen's podcast, and I had a very similar situation. I had a condition that resulted in my what's a good way to say it? I was no longer offered admission to West Point because of a uncorrectable vision in one eye.
Right.
So I had 20/20 vision in my left eye, and I still have it to this day. But on the right eye, my father took me to 3 or 4 ophthalmologists, and they were all ethical, honest men.
Sadly.
And none were willing to say that it was correctable.
Right.
So I had to apply for a waiver, and I did not know I was going to West Point until approximately 10 days before our day. I was sent to Keller Hospital, and I'll share you with this now, my technique. Because prior to going, I had to go to Keller for an ophthalmologic examination, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was told by the technician, and this was before I met the doctor, and he said, well, cover your good eye. So I covered my good eye with my best Mr. Spock imitation, and I fired off EOPFD. I knew I had to miss one. I knew exactly where the 20/20 line was. And then I got called back to see the physician, and the physician is like, he's filing through some papers, and he's looking, and he looks up and he goes, your vision is only slightly off from 20/20. I don't see why we can't recommend you for a waiver.
There you go.
So I'm going to put you in for a waiver. And sure enough, next day, I got some type of notification. I think it was telephonically that I could report to West Point.
You had all the
So that
boxes
was
ticked except that last test, and you passed that one with a little Mr. Spock action.
that's right. Help from Mr. Spock and the Star Trek generation.
Which so you
but
were an
thank God
A1 as an upperclassman. Where were you as a plebe?
So I was in Charlie 3, the Fighting Gamecocks. We're now no longer able to say our motto at the time. So it was a great company to be in as a plebe. I probably had more fun in that company than I should have. But it got me into a little bit of trouble with the dean.
So talk about that.
Well, on our day, my roommate and I, Brian Shoup, stayed up probably till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning folding socks, thinking we were going to get a jump on everybody and get things ready for the room. Within the next day or two, we had validations for, all of our various specialties. And I can specifically remember not being able to stay awake during the validations. So here I had calculus, I had chemistry. I could not stay awake.
But
so
your
I got
socks
put in
were
rock
perfect.
And my socks looked great. They had the little smiley on them, but I could not stay awake. So I wound up getting put in rock math. Mm-hmm. And that to me, I went with it. I mean, I knew this math. I mean, it was simple addition, subtraction, division. Right. When I say rock math, it was not for geniuses. Right. But, and this is the but, you had so many competing interests at the time. I remember my first WPR, I think it was a 2-star day or whatever. I was studying other things because I knew this math cold. Well, obviously I didn't know the math cold, or my exactness wasn't on. I got an F on the first WPR. Wow. The second WPR, I got an F because I slept through the class. I missed it. So I had 2 Fs. And finally, the company scholastic officer sat me down and said, Callahan, you gotta zone in on this, because this is the only class at West Point you cannot fail. There's something called the Dean's Trip section. Do you know what that is? And I said, no, sir. He said, well, that's where the dean sends you home, and that's it. That's where you are. And he goes, if you fail rock math, you're on the Dean's Trip section.
That's the last stop, right?
Yes. So I buckled down at that point academically. I buckled down.
Okay.
And I was able to kind of make.
Obviously, if you're a physician today, you have the ability to retain information, and you've got the intelligence for it. What was it? Was it just literally just so much going on you didn't focus, or?
I think so much was going on. Yeah. I mean, part of me was, and I'm not saying I was rebellious, but coming from Catholic school in the north side of the city, I was a little bit of a juvenile delinquent in a way.
Though you were an NCFL standout.
That's right. That's right. So I can remember as a plebe going off post with John Boulay in our first semester down to New City to a discotheque, while most people would have never dreamed of doing stuff like that.
Right.
So we would go out in the trunk of his girlfriend's car, and we'd come back, right before taps, but we were having a grand and glorious time exploring the sites around West Point.
As a plebe, you were in the back of it. You were in the trunk of a car, secreting yourself off post. So I think that sets a tone.
And I got caught once by Elena King Hyduke, wearing a yearling blazer, and I was over in 4th Reg enjoying life as an upperclassman. And she knew me she was in 5th Company. I was in 6th. She was a Canandaigua girl. And I was walking around the barracks, and she heard me talking to somebody walking down the middle of the hallway. And she's like, Jack, get over here. Get over here. You're going to get in trouble. And I was like, Elena, shut up. You're going to blow it.
Yeah, Elena, you're the problem.
That's right. You're the problem. So I had been down with my merry band of brothers at Ike Hall from 5:30 to 8:30. We'd wait for the cage to go up. We would sit there and drink beer. And then at 8:30, we all got kicked out of Eisenhower Hall, and we were off to our own devices.
So, Jack, it really does sound like the fact that you stayed up late folding socks too often was the problem.
That's right. That set the tone, got me on the wrong track, and I never went back to being Strack after that.
That's right. So,
gave
Now you
up
went
that
from
clean living.
C3, which I would call a reasonable company in terms of its professionalism and its standards. Then they tossed you into A1. What is it? A1 or be gone, be straight or be gone, all that stuff. How
Be
was that
straight or be gone. You
transition?
can't say that anymore either.
Yeah, right. Be strack or be gone. We'll just
Right. Be strack or be gone.
how
Exactly.
was that transition for you as a young yearling?
So it was a good company as an upperclassman. I got to say, it was very, very difficult for the freshmen. I would not have changed places, my upbringing in C3 to be a plebe in A1. But A1, that was a very well-run company. I mean, we won the superintendent's award. They were, it was just, I think it was held to a higher standard. So there was help academically if you needed it. We had a great group of guys. I had Doug Black in my company, Tom Hood, Lee Quinnis, John Thompson, Kevin Arbanis. We had a cast of characters
That's an
that we
all-star
all more or
cast
less
there.
pitched in. Yeah, it was an all-star cast. Yeah.
That's great. And
But
then
that's why I also have,
did it stay that sorted out for all 3 years? Because I know General Caslin was your TAC for a while and things like that. What was was it that way all the way through?
well, so in C3, I had Captain Innes, who then went on to become the regimental TAC.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of saved me as a firstie. I can tell you that story in a bit. We had Caslin, and that's when Caslin discovered Doug Black playing on the intramural football team.
Oh, is that
And
right?
then the following 2 years, we had Captain Mosier, who I see from time to time at these marchback events, and he and I are good friends now, friends on Facebook, which still to my mind is blows my mind. But back to Captain Innes. As a plebe, I remember my first meeting with him. I went in there and he's like, "So Callahan, you're from Syracuse?" I go, "Yes, sir." He goes, "How's it going here? Have you met anybody?" And I said, "Well, Captain Innes," I go, "it's not like in your day where you had Lady Cliff." I go, "That was like shooting pigs in a barrel." And he looked at me, he goes, "Callahan, I married a Lady Cliff girl." And I said, "Oh my God." My
Well,
mouth has gotten me in trouble.
that's setting a
But
tone.
then my senior year, I sent up an exception to policy. I wanted to go to, the girl I was seeing at the time was out in Miami of Ohio, and I
Mm-hmm.
sent up an exception to policy. And, you know, it went up to Captain Mosier and he denied it. He should have denied it. I mean, I was on restriction for something I had done. And he's like, 3 reasons: it's late, you're on restriction, and blah, blah, blah. Went up to Major Innes and Major Innes approved it. He goes, "Have a good weekend hunting," the old reference to shooting
Yeah.
pigs in a barrel. And I was like, well, and I think, Captain Mosier to this day is like, who the heck does he know?
Still
But that
hasn't
was my plebe
forgiven you.
check on the RTO.
And what got you on that restriction, just to bring some flavor to the podcast?
So I think that restriction may have been with Dwayne Linnenkugel and Lee Quinnis coming home to Syracuse and taking too much time getting back to TAPS. I can remember being, running and you could hear the bugle call sounding, the recall formation. And, you used to have to report yourself at the time that you were late for recall. And I think we wound up getting, we were firsties at the time. I think I wound up getting close to 20 hours for that
Oh,
debacle
there you
because
go.
I
Okay.
was,
Well, you reported yourself, so you stayed on the right side of it. And it certainly
yes, we
didn't
were on the
slow
right.
Lee Quintus down at all. I just had a chance to see him recently.
Did not,
He did
did
very
not
well,
slow down.
right?
Yeah. He's done very well for
He
himself.
did very well, despite the Syracuse incident. What did you study when you were at the academy?
So I studied, we didn't have majors back then. I hear people saying I majored in this. I think I had two electives because I was in rock math. That took up one of my electives.
Okay.
I studied international affairs. I still get mailings from the Soch department. I guess I'm considered an alum.
You're on the
So
list.
I'm on the Soch mailing list. But so I did well enough in those courses. I mean, I had figured it out academically by the time Cow year rolled around. I actually made the dean's list.
Yeah.
And then, I did well enough. I got asked back by two departments. You would get a letter put in your file saying, "Hey, we've identified you as a potential future teacher or professor at West Point. If you're interested, we've put a letter in your file." So one was the Department of History and the other was, I think, CNGS.
Look at you.
Because I took
My file was blissfully
cartography.
clear of those letters. So this is the first I've heard of that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You would get a letter put in your file and they would let you know at the time. I remember walking around Washington Hall thinking, well, what am I going to do with myself this summer? Because, I did your standard rotations. I did drill cadet program. I did air
Sure.
assault. But between, yeah, it was, I think, sophomore and junior year, I had one of the best experiences of my life. I got to go to Bolivia as an exchange cadet, not speaking Spanish. Now, mind you, I had had high school Spanish, but Major Hakopian, I remember him to this day. I was seeing all the lists of where you could go, and I took German. So I'm like, I'd like to go to Germany. I'd like to go to Austria. And he's like, what's your GPA? And I'm like, well, it's a 2.6, 2.67. He said, well, no, that won't work. He goes, have you ever thought of going to any of these other countries in Spain? Because, they had a lot of countries in Latin America, El Salvador, Nicaragua was the only one you couldn't go to. But basically, nobody had picked Bolivia, and they needed, a cadet to go, and they picked me to go to Bolivia. Back then too, I mean, I got to see my first use of cocaine, by people, and we became very, very sick from the altitude. And I remember we were worried about testing positive because the answer that they gave you was mate de coca, which was tea made from the cocoa leaf. And I was
Right.
with a cow at the time, Brent Schwanevelt, who spoke fluent Spanish. I would have been up the river. He was a Mormon missionary at one point, and he went with me, and he literally translated everything for me.
He handled
He
all
handled
all
all
the
the
language.
talking, and I was the recreation officer during the visit. He handled all the details. So, but Bolivia
And
was
then
a
how
very
did that trip
interesting.
change your perspective on serving on the academy? You said it was the best time you had. How did it change your ideas?
Just that there were options out there, that you had to kind of seize or ask for. I mean, I think, that's been one of the trends in the podcast. There were things at West Point that we were not aware of. That, I think if you dug a little deeper, we had many opportunities. Now, granted, what they offer cadets in this day and age far exceeds the offerings that we had, but there were still things that you could do, outside the standard airborne air assault kind of mode things. And I would go
It's
every
great.
I would go every spring break. I would take a cadet, and we would go see my family in Germany because my mother still had family, and we would space a Mac fly out of McGuire Air Force Base. There was always the issue of, where are we getting back? Are we getting back? And one time we
Right.
wound up in the Azores, but you got to see things that you would have never ever seen. You know, so
Now, starting with rock math all the way through to Dean's List later on, you're in improbable choice on paper for artillery. What was it that drew you to the branch?
the Defense Language Institute slot. So I,
Really? How
I
so?
enjoyed the rotation. Where we were firing 105s out at Buckner. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And again, I keep referencing my father, who was in the infantry, and he said, I used to watch those artillery guys drive by, and we were marching. And he gave me other tips, like always sleep between two trees. He goes, he remembered guys
Right.
getting crushed, by tanks that were so tired. But he goes, join the artillery. So that probably played a role in my decision. But then there was a slot where I could go to the 74th Detachment in Germany, guaranteed. And I was going to get a side trip to Monterey for 10 months to learn German. And I had already taken German. So it was win-win. Path of least.
What was it about the 74th that called for a language slot? That's
So
interesting.
it was the an Allied unit that was Pershing 1A. It was part
Okay.
of the German Air Force unit. So we were under the commander of the 4th Allied Tactical Air Force, but we had a very large detachment where the bunkers were where the warheads were, and it was a theater nuclear weapon. So it was not as accurate as Pershing 2, but it was far more devastating in kilotonnage. I mean, you're talking, and it's now declassified. It was basically a 200 to 400 kiloton weapon. And we had a quick reaction site down in alpine locations. So whenever you see those pictures of Neuschwanstein, the beautiful, crazy King Ludwig Castle, we had our quick reaction site in that neighborhood, so to say, where we would have
Okay.
missiles ready to launch, at a moment's notice.
It's pretty astonishing to think that we lived in a time and served in a time when kilotonnage thrown around the battlefield was considered a solution.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
you never really thought of those things. I mean, as an adult, you can get there and you can sit there and be reflective. But, I can
Right.
remember going through the exercises at night. We had two types of exercises which were common. There was the Nuke X meaning it was an exercise, 5-1,
Hmm.
and that was a selective nuclear release, the 5-1. And then you had the 6-1. And what was the 6-1? It was GNR. And I'm not talking Guns N' Roses, it was general nuclear release. And that's when
Right.
you were literally just getting your missiles off and you were picking targets of opportunity, from like a target list book. So, I mean, to think that
You were one instrument in a larger symphony at that point. So
absolutely,
just get them off the ground, right?
and
Yeah.
so it was a serious business at the time. Uh,
Very sobering,
it
yeah,
was
to
so.
be doing that. And then how long did you stay in, and
So
did this remain a
I got
specialty,
out
or
when
did it?
pretty much the drawdown started to happen. I did a
Mm,
fair amount of work with the German medical people there. I'm not crediting them with my medical career, but I was the translator for a lot of the medical records because they didn't go to a medical facility that was American. They would go to the German, the
mhm.
sanitators, the German clinic. And because we were part of the personnel reliability program, the PRP, everybody that had a job that was a sensitive nuclear job, and everybody carried, cosmic top secret atomic clearances, CTSA.
Right.
I'd have to translate, well, they're on this, and this is the effect of the medicine, and then you'd write up a brief report that would go into their medical chart, and then an American medical doctor would review that. So I'm translating it from German into American medicalese, and then the American medical doctor would say, pull him from duty, do this and do that.
You mentioned your mom is native
Yeah.
German. Did you speak German in the home growing up, and did
So
that
I knew enough to get my
lead
face
you
slapped, but no, my mother made a conscious effort to not speak
to not?
German in the home. But she had a very hard life. She grew up in Nazi Germany, and
Sure.
she emigrated in 1952. She met my father working in a Gasthof in bombed out Nuremberg, and there really was nothing left for her on the farm. Her mother died in 1944, so during the war.
Hmm.
And actually, my grandfather was the Burgermeister. You can infer what that means. You didn't get to be a Burgermeister in
Yeah.
Third Reich Germany unless you were a party member. So she moved to Nuremberg immediately after the war because there was no work, nothing on the farm, and her father had remarried. So we have wicked stepmom stories in the family. But she had a very
Yeah.
hard life, and she met Americans that actually liberated in her hometown the end of the Flossenburg concentration camp march. So she was there,
Mm.
and we've got another family story about how she got to go and she fed some of the concentration camp people, literally in the last days of their life because they were forced out of Flossenburg, and the march ended in her very small town. I mean, this is like a population, about 100, 150 people. And her
Right.
father's the Burgermeister, and she remembers one of the Jewish people grabbing her by the arm. My mom
Hmm.
she was born in 32, so she's 13 years old at the time, old enough to remember. She remembers this Jewish person grabbing her by the arm, and my mom had just given them bread. And the Jewish person said to her, "May you live a long life." And my
Hmm.
mom looked at her thinking, what an odd thing to say, may you live a long life.
Right.
And sure enough, the next morning, the SS marched these people up over the hill and murdered a bunch of them. So
Yeah.
she got to have a horrible experience, and ultimately, I think that played a role in why she wanted to leave Germany, and she didn't come back until I was over there in
Is that right? And she
19,
come back over.
1988. So she went from 52 to 88, 89 without going back to her home country. So,
What a story.
yeah. So
So where did the idea of medicine come from? I mean, you
I think my sister and, working with the German military, I was going to be a lawyer.
okay.
And, my sister said, well, you got a brother who's a lawyer and he's miserable. And her husband was a doctor at the time. And she said, you'd be a good doctor. And I go, yeah, I'll be 32 when I graduate. She goes, yeah. And if you
Right.
don't go to medical school,
So old.
you're going to be 32, you know?
Right.
So I said, all right, I'll give this medical school thing a try. Enrolled at Northern Virginia Community College, completed the prerequisites, and I was able to get into Syracuse, like I said, after the first 2 years at New York Med. I I had help though getting into medical school. I was not getting in on my GPA. As I was
Okay, yeah.
applying,
What was the help?
kept getting rejected.
Lock fingers?
No, that didn't
That
help.
doesn't work for
The
medical
West
school.
Point ring helped. I'm not wearing the ring, but I called West Point, and I kept
Did
going,
you really?
all of these places, are asking me for a pre-medical advisory committee letter. How do I get this? And West Point said, well, did you do that when you were here? And I said, no, I didn't do that when I was, I didn't know I wanted to go to medical school at West Point. They go, well,
Sure.
where are you? I go, I'm in DC. They go, well, go see this guy at Walter Reed, and he loves West Pointers. So I go and I make an appointment with a colonel there, and I go into his office, very disjointed interview. He's answering phones, hanging up this and that. Where do you want to go to medical school, Callahan? And I go, Syracuse. He goes, nah, no good. The dean just left there. He goes, have you thought about Tulane? And I go, Tulane, like New Orleans? He goes, yeah, Tulane. He goes, it's a great school. He goes, did you put that one down? I go, no, I didn't put it down. What about Vermont? Vermont's a great school. Have you thought about going to Vermont? He did this with about 4 or 5 different schools all over the country
Yeah,
that
right.
exceeded, their reputation exceeded my academic ability. He said, look, we could do this for 10, 15 minutes. Talk about where you want to go. How about this? Write down your top 10 schools. Put the ones that I told you to put on there. If you haven't heard from anybody in like 10 days, call me back. Here's my card. Take the card, go out in the hallway, and I read the card. It says, Colonel Norman Ream, Counselor to the Surgeon General of the United States, Advisor on Academic Medicine. I go, that's a good card.
That's a good
Phone
card.
started ringing off the hook. Would I like to come to Tulane for an interview? Did I want to go to New York Med for an interview? How about Vermont for an interview? And literally, that's because
Jack, they used to tell us you should have a Rolodex of cards. Sometimes you only need one card.
that was the card to have. Literally, he handed out ROTC scholarships to everybody.
right.
So after I finally got in, because Uniformed Services said, no, we don't want him back. He's medically disabled.
Yeah, that's
I
it.
had high blood pressure. I graduate medical school. One of the first calls I get is from Army Medicine. Have I ever thought about a career in Army Medicine? And I go, huh, that's funny. I'm medically disqualified. You said I had high blood pressure and I can't go back in. They go, oh, that's waiverable. So
That's a waiver.
that's a waiverable condition. But
Yeah, but I can't see so good.
that's right.
Now, for those of us who don't understand the medical career,
Yeah.
talk about the arc of how you started becoming a doctor and then ended up in the very interesting specialty you have now. What was your path?
So again, I went to New York Med, and on the first day of class, I'm seeing one of my classmates there greet me. He's now a second year, Jerry Curran. And I walk in and he's like, hey, Jack, what are you doing here? And I'm like, Jerry, what are you doing here? He's like, oh, I'm a second year now. So Jerry kind of took me under his wing, gave me his used books. I mean, talk about a West Point network. He kind of helped pave the path for the first 2 years for me. Medical school, like I said, as an Army officer or ex-Army officer, it was simple. It was just volume of information. And I was always good at memorization. And I think we have it over the civilian counterparts because I just made it my job. I'd show up every single day. And I elected to go into internal medicine because from internal medicine, you could literally pick any subspecialty, cardiology, gastroenterology, you name it. You could do it from internal medicine. My plans got thwarted to specialize. I would have maybe considered being a cardiologist, but my wife and I had started our family by the time I was in residency. And there was a lot of impetus. I had no income for the 4 years of medical school. I had very little income as a resident. So, financial considerations made me go and take a job, but
Sure.
it's worked out. It's been a great, great career. They pay me literally
And did you
to talk to people.
all your children born in Syracuse?
So I've got one that was born in Cooperstown. When I went to Columbia University's residency, that was in Cooperstown for internal medicine. So a daughter was born there in Cooperstown. Another 2 sons were born in Watertown, and then the rest were born here in Syracuse.
How many total do you have?
I have 5 children.
5 children. And you were in a family of 7. So
correct.
Christmas time is very busy in the Callahan universe. What and are the 5 local, or have they spread out a little bit?
We have 4 that are in the military currently. So my oldest daughter is a West Point graduate. She's class of 2020. She was
Oh,
the
wow.
COVID class. So for a while, I had, my daughter home during the COVID break, actually taking all of her academics from here. She was sworn in
Ah,
on my kitchen table, on her
there
graduation
you go.
day. And then they gathered them all up, brought them back to the plane, and we couldn't attend the graduation. I watched my daughter's graduation on a Zoom call. But she's
Oh,
class of
boy.
2020.
Okay.
She branched cyber. She was a computer science major. She branched cyber. She's now down in Fort Stewart, Georgia, and she just
Okay.
got a master's degree in data analytics. So she's deciding what she's going to do for her future. You know.
There you go.
Number two is a Naval Academy graduate, class of 22. He's a
Wow.
cybersecurity major, and he leads a charmed life. He was going to be a flight officer, but the pipeline was taking about a year and a half to 2 years before they would start because of the COVID backlog. So he's like, Dad, I think I'm going to become a cryptologic warfare officer. So he switched.
Mhm.
They offered him a stint. Now he's at Monterey, the Naval Postgraduate School, and he's getting a master's in computer
Okay.
science on the Navy. But it's funny, he's wound up at the same place that I wound up more or less for
Yeah.
first assignment. He's in Monterey and he absolutely loves it. He's a musician as well, so he plays every Thursday night in Carmel by the Sea.
There
He's
you go.
he's improving. He's got to get his 10,000 experiences in before he's a master, but he's showing a lot of progress. Then I've got a firstie son at West Point, Eric. Yeah,
Really?
Eric is there now. We're going down for ring weekend this weekend, and he's a very solid, cadet. He's going to branch infantry. So we're looking forward to enjoying his first year with some trips down to West Point. And then I've got
Sure.
the next son is Henry, and Henry is a youngster at the Naval Academy. So
Holy
yeah,
cow.
he's thinking of studying, cybersecurity as well. That's the same thing his older brother did, just because of the opportunities that they have. And he probably will go what they call surface warfare with the nuke school. So they call it nuke SWO. And they go to
Right.
Charleston and learn about nuclear propulsion, and then they become a SWO. And then you can transfer if you want to cryptologic warfare with his background. And then our
So
last,
that's 4 of 5. Now, what about the
yeah,
fifth?
she's the decider. That's Kate. Our youngest is
Yeah.
Kate. She's currently in high school. She's a sophomore. She's probably the smartest of all the children that we have. I mean, she is bright. She's curious. Um, there's naturally pressure on her to make a decision. We don't pressure them. I'd like to have a doctor actually out of one of my children. So I've told her, if you don't want to go the military
Right.
route,
What's left?
yeah, that's acceptable. She can go whatever route she wants.
So just at a high level, obviously we'd have to talk to them to get their perspective of why they chose the academy, the 4 of them. And what was it? Because you served for a short period of time, like a lot of us. What was it that engendered such interest in the academy on their part? Were you
So the three boys,
big
I don't know if it was so
enthusiast?
much interest as opposed to competition. Once they saw their older sister could do it and graduate, it was like throwing the gauntlet down to them. Like, oh, if she can do it, we can do it. Claire, I think they're all motivated to serve. And I think if you go down there, like I did expose that we would go to the Army Navy game. I would go down there,
Sure.
for other things, but usually football is the entree. If you meet and talk to these other cadets, I mean, we'd like to think that our group has the special sauce. We can't hold a candle to what, these kids are like now. I mean, they're
Absolutely.
intelligent,
Yeah.
they're athletic, they're committed. I mean, you have conversations, or I'm fortunate. I'm still in the mix where I get to meet, these kids from all over the country. And it's like talking to my
Sure.
classmates again. The same right stuff, it's still there. Lee Quinn has
And
pointed out to me
I'm
when he was at ForceCom. So Lee was at ForceCom. We were talking, and he had a very telling insight that this is really becoming a family business. And I don't think that's good for
mhm.
the military either. Dan Hokinson said the same thing. I mean, if you look at his family, it's a family of service. So I think we're losing something that, from a demographic, we're not really spreading it out as much as we should. Because becoming a family business is one thing, but we want the military to be representative of what's going on in America.
So you certainly have had a tremendous amount of success. You have outstandingly talented crop of kids for sure. Just hearing that. 60 years old. What advice would you give your 40-year-old self, given the fact you've had such stability? But if you could go back, what advice would you give?
Probably to be more humane, more show more vulnerability, I guess, because that opens yourself up to so many different people, that then can approach you. I think as West Pointers, I had it drilled into my head, be technically and tactically proficient. And I was, but the humanities aspect of it, I think is somewhat lost in the military, and I deal a lot now with, mental health issues related to older veterans in their service, and I can approach it with empathy. I just wish I had had more empathy as a younger man, that, medicine has given me insight into that though. And it's made me a better person. But that's a hard thing. I've just seen it on a day-to-day basis to try to be more empathetic and humane to people. And, showing my vulnerabilities is not showing I'm a weak person. It's actually a position of strength, so.
Wise words, wise words that we always learn too late.
Correct.
These things,
Yes.
right?
Should know.
Jack Callahan, what a pleasure talking to you. You're absolutely you're a fascinating adventure you've had, and you really have brought a great story to the class. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I've enjoyed these podcasts immensely. It's almost like I get to sit down with my classmates again and hear the parts of their lives that, I missed out on, where they went after the academy. But it's very familiar sounding to talk and to listen, but I'm very grateful for you for doing this. I've enjoyed speaking.
It's my pleasure. It's a pleasure having you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Courage Never Quits podcast, where any member of the class of 1986 who is willing to tell their story will be a guest. To get the word out and to stay up to date on the latest episodes, hit the like and subscribe buttons. With 954 living graduates in the class, we have a lot of stories to collect, and you don't want to miss any of them. We'll see you in the next episode.